Hello, everyone, and welcome to the importance of data validation for an effective regulatory control framework, brought to you in partnership with SmartStream. This is Alexia from Connect Global Group, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar today. Before we begin, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you could use. All widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize to full screen by clicking on the arrow in the top right corner. We would of course love to hear from you, so please submit your questions to us at any point during this webinar. If we do run out of time, we'll make sure to follow up with you in a separate email after the event is over. Now, for the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or sessions that are running in the background. You can also find additional tips in the help widget at the bottom of your screen. Finally, a reminder that a copy of today's session will be available the next few hours, so please look out for that email. And without any further delay, let's get started. I'll hand you over to our moderator. Over to you, Linda.
Thanks, Alexia, and thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss the importance of data validation as part of an effective regulatory control framework. In every aspect of our daily lives, both personally and professionally, data has taken over and is now more than ever a very important component of any success criteria. So today we're going to be focusing on how data, especially data accuracy, is a key component of a successful regulatory control framework. With current day regulations mandating the implementation of a robust control framework, it's critical for firms to have the necessary reporting processes in place, and that those processes are being governed with strong control points. Since accurate data is key to accurate reporting, those control points need to take into consideration the health of a firm's data. I'm very excited to dive into the subject matter, and I'm so pleased to have a number of thought leaders in this space join us today. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists for today's conversation. Why don't we kick it off with a quick introductions? Adrian, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I'm Adrian Dale. I work at ISLA, the International Security Lending Association. I'm the head of regulation and market practice. And the market practice bit actually has various aspects to it, like market practices, obviously, the best practice handbook and the digital projects that we're working on at the moment as well.
Wonderful. Romualdo?
Yes, my name is Romualdo Gonzalez, and I'm the head of all the capital reporting at Nordea, the Scandinavian-based bank. I'm also the functional lead for the overall capital adequacy reporting. And basically on the day-to-day basis, our core activities is to ensure that all the data is flowing correctly, is having the correct calculation according to the corresponding regulation. And at the end, obviously, provide common reporting reports back to the financial authorities.
Wonderful, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. Chris Owers. I am the UK head of transaction reporting at UBS, covering MiFID II, EMIR, and SFTR, including our delegated reporting offering.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Ian.
Hi, my name is Ian. I'm one of the co-founders of Kaizen Reporting. And we were set up almost exclusively to help financial firms identify accuracy issues in their reporting, as well as completeness. And we cover trade and transaction reporting, including the ones that Chris just mentioned, but also those in the States, such as DFA, and in APAC, ASEC, MAS, Canada, and Canada back in North America.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. So why don't we start the discussion off with an overview of what a good control framework really involves. The term control framework, I think, is used a lot, but I suspect there's still some uncertainty. What are we really talking about? So Romualdo, would you like to kick us off with what you think are the core components of a good control framework?
Sure, definitely. Well, in my view, the core components of a control framework should be starting from the control being an end-to-end control. So what does that mean? That is a very broad term, basically. But I would say that it needs to start at a data capture stage, where there's a clear governance on the expectations. On the second part would be on the data processing part, where there will be also very clear governance and expectations to the data providers. And at the last part will be a clear data validation and aggregation for being able to put together the data in all the different dimensions that is required for the different reports that needs to go out to the regulators, for example. And at the end, one key part will be to have a clear feedback loop to each of these stages, so that there could be improvements for the data quality perspective from one reporting period to another.
Ian, it would be great to hear your thoughts from a service provider. What key elements are you encouraging your clients to focus on?
Yeah, certainly. I think I can approach it wearing two hats. Actually, before we set Kaizen up, I was responsible for designing and implementing a control framework globally for reg reporting. And we really took our lead from what we were hearing from the regulators about what was important to them from a control framework point of view. One half is the accuracy of the data, which Kaizen focuses on identifying those issues. But the broader areas that the regulators expect firms to have in place around a control framework talk to the point that was made previously about the end-to-end process. So not only do you have to test continuously test independently to check whether the data is correct, but it's what you do with the issues once they're identified. So having a really strong issue escalation issue escalation and categorization of issues is really important, because you want to surface the most important issues to senior management and then onto the regulator so that the organization can respond. And in order to do that, another element of the control framework that's really important is getting the governance in place and getting that correct. And I think we've seen in the UK and elsewhere, there's been a real focus on senior management being part of that governance process so that you can actually affect change in the quality of the reporting. And I think other elements which are really important, change management. If you do get reporting correct, this other certainty is that new issues will be introduced. And finally, training in the obligations so that the organisation and the individuals have a base understanding. All of these components taken together to get, in addition to the accuracy testing, are really what the regulators are looking for when they think of a good control framework. I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Ian. That was very thorough. Chris, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add that may have been missed by your fellow panelists.
Yeah, no, if I build on that a little bit. So we look at control frameworks that sort of I'm familiar with, but also discussing with my peers, what is starting to become a bit of a common grouping of sort of controls. So very much the first thing is a central database or log of all of your obligations so that it's transparent to the organization. For each of those, there is, you would want some form of interpretation and understanding of how you meet them, or what you need to do, and then how you meet them. That then feeds in, like Ian said, into governance, but also, you have your changes, so managing your changes and your day-to-day controls. What is it you're running every day that are your red lights when things, or red flags even, as things start to happen? And then separate to that, and Ian's touched on it, is your testing, your independent testing. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. So that's from a high level the key components. So if we look at the approaches, right? So everybody seems to be approaching this a little bit different, and I wanted to hear from the panel about whether you see firms, or whether you're approaching it from a holistic perspective across regulations, or if this is more a regulation by regulation type approach. And then adding to that, or on the same grounds, are people reacting more proactively now that the controls are more mandated, or are we still in more of a reactive, environment? Romualdo, if you want to take that.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. So I would say it's a divided story depending on the history of the financial institution in question, I would say. What's happening at the moment is that there's still a lot of reactive activities, I would claim, that we're still trying to live up to the ones that were already put into practice a couple of years back, and trying to make sure that there is a strong framework around those. And meanwhile, we do have some mandated activities that can be claimed already. And I think that's what needs to be a clear change in the mentality of the financial institutions, is to figure out a way to go from just reacting to the regulation that is still coming and has been coming, to how can you proactively activate those frameworks already now and invest in them in the right manner. Otherwise, you will always end up in a reactive form as they come one after one. And by doing that, reacting, you will just be following up the data qualities that you figure out once those have been implemented. So I think that's what the shift needs to happen, that figure out a way to go from the reacting to a predictive of how to put this into practice.
Thank you. Adrian, can you, are there any recent regulations that come to mind that force firms to think about new controls around data elements, newer data elements, whether they would approach it, again, regulatory to regulatory or more cohesively? I know we're probably all thinking about a couple of the fields that were forced on the industry, in my eyes, is a positive thing, forced on the industry in the last few recent regulations. So can you talk about a couple of those maybe?
You mean like SFTR, for instance? Is that one of the ones? Yeah, yeah. That was a nicely hidden one. Yeah. There's so many different there's so many different thoughts on it. It's difficult to know how to start. So certainly, I mean, there was the EMIR and SFTR, the similarity between them. So some of the people who had worked on EMIR, they said there was like a natural progression, I suppose, a continuation of a learning curve they'd gone through under EMIR. Okay, so that was a benefit, but at the same time, there's a lot of silos that happen in financial markets, and so the EMIR reporting happened in a silo over there, and yes, it could be uprooted. Some people did that, and they recreated it to do their SFTR reporting, but there were new data fields that came out. And the point that Romualdo was just making, just super interesting, because I think that what happens, and you look at SFTR as a great example, there's like a shopping list of fields that the regulators think they have to have. And so they start off with that, and then they look at other standards around the world and what things should I have, like our good friend, the LEI, the legal entity identifier is a fantastic standard. And then there's some other things perhaps they've got in other regulations and they think they should have that. So you end up with this, we'll just say 150 plus type of fields. We're in SFTR, and then you hear later on that actually they're not going to use all of those fields anyway, so they've obviously got more than they want. And part of the reason that happens is because there's the regulations looking at various different markets, and it's trying to find the commonality of something common between those markets, and then asking a question which doesn't fit all of them precisely. So you end up with all this sort of backwards and forwards of what does it actually mean? What do I put into that field? And sometimes it isn't relevant at all. You also miss things, so there's not enough currency fields or date fields to be able to describe the activity properly. And so this is where I come back to Romualdo's point, is that when regulators are asked for something, then the only thing you can do is be reactive, because you've got no idea what they're going to ask for. And it's much better if it goes the other way around and the market has a better, like a standard, this is how this market operates, and the regulator looks at it and goes, fantastic, I'll have that, thank you very much. And that happens in some mature markets, or where there's everything's transacted on an exchange, for instance, why there are lots of regulators talking about things like having an exchange for securities lending or a CCP, for instance. So then there's a standard model that they can pick stuff up from. But that still doesn't solve some of the legacy issues inside a market. So like I said, there's so many different angles I could go on from there. So I'll stop there, otherwise I'm going to use up other people's ammunition. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to pick up from the data piece that you just spoke about, some of the data challenges. And now that we've discussed the core components and the approach, let's dive a little deeper into the data aspect So what components of the control framework, if you look at it in its entirety, are especially sensitive to data management and data validation? And so, Ian, if I can turn to you to kick it off on this discussion.
Yeah, sure. And maybe just linking to the last question about how reactive or proactive firms have been around putting in place the right controls. I think we've seen a massive change in firms actually being more proactive in building out control frameworks. And that's due to a number of reasons. Some of them are mandated by the regulation themselves or by conduct regulations such as SMCR. But increasingly, we're seeing firms, certainly some of the more thoughtful, or those that have been involved in reporting for a long term, looking at the return on investment of having the proper controls in upfront. Because doing remediation projects on incorrect data is much more costly than any fine a firm's going to get. So, so we're beginning to see that firms are winning that battle with its counterintuitive to go and find issues, because that's what regulators want you to do. And there certainly are still significant issues in the data quality that we see. And I think too often people confuse validation with accurate data. So just because a data item is valid, so it's past certain basic syntax validation rules, it doesn't mean that that data is accurate. And that's a big thing that we highlight to firms. For MiFID, for example, we've tested over 2.8 billion records since MiFID 2 go live. And amazingly, only 15% of those records had no data accuracy issues. And they all passed the validation of the regulator or the third party that they sent the data to. So it's really important that firms don't confuse the test of data of validation with accuracy. And similarly, we see the other big measurement of data quality that the regulators are looking for is completeness. And again, we're seeing, depending on the regime, anything between 15 and 25% of underreporting when we test for clients. So, I think it's really important to make that distinction between what's valid and accurate. So our idea is that you can be valid but wrong. And to give a very clear example of that, the price might be in the right format, but it's the wrong price for that record, and so on and so on for the fields that are reported.
Thanks, Ian. I think that also comes up with reconciliation, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. So two firms can reconcile and say, hey, I got it right, but actually both firms are wrong. So I definitely think that comes up a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think reconciliations are predominantly, they do have an accuracy element to them, but they're predominantly about completeness. And too often we see firms not actually building reconciliations in the right way. They'll only reconcile the data that's left the firm rather than independently looking at the data that they didn't send out and asking, have I excluded something from the reporting process that I should have included?
Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you've probably seen the evolution both from a technology solution likes of where Ian is, but more just from firms' approach to that in terms of different market communications and as fines and enforcements are issued, they'll talk about ensuring that you are testing your data, testing the data to external sources, to the regulator in certain specific cases. So the valid but wrong, I think is becoming increasingly understood within the industry, with more work to do to address that. That would be to add.
Thank you, Chris. Romualdo, anything from you on this topic about data sensitivity or validations?
I think Ian and Chris were touching up on a topic that is really close in the Nordics, I would say, is about the reconciliation activities. And I think just to add to that, it will be, there are complications when having lots of complex data components that need to reconcile in different levels. And what is difficult to find is an aggregation activity that can accurately measure that to make sure that whatever is not reconciling is completely being taken part of the process. And so I think that's the difficulty in the framework is how can you accurately assess what part of the reconciliation process should be enhanced in the right manner to be able to accurately report the numbers. As Ian was saying, they might be passing the validation. However, they may not be accurate. So I think that is, I would say, a component that is a little bit difficult to put into the practice, so to speak.
So I'm going to stay with you if you don't mind, and go on to the next topic, which is, so you're talking about all these controls, et cetera. We know that the RegTech industry is exploding at the moment. There's a lot of good specialists in this area, but how do you know how to make sure that your control framework and all that accuracy that you're all talking about recently is getting taken care of by your third party? So where does your control framework start and stop when you have solutions that you're using within your regulatory reporting, process?
I think it's Ian was the one that mentioned this at the beginning. It's all about the requirements posted to the RegTech solutions and to the third-party stakeholders that any institution might be using, and it needs to be very clearly defined the threshold of acceptance. Because at the end of the day, it is the financial institution is still accountable for the reporting. So at some phase of this area doesn't go through, the financial institution still needs to adhere to the responses from the regulator, right? So I would say it's crucial to have a very clear accountability framework in the SLA that is done together with the third party to secure that process.
Understood. Adrian, can I come to you? What are your thoughts around third parties and control framework?
Right. So there are different appetites that firms have about using third parties, and so what happens because of that is some go a little bit further than others. So some will be, here's everything, just do it all for me, I don't care, or I'll only give you a little bit. Again, excellent points being made there. So the things that people look at is, where is my data? What's the jurisdiction of that location of the data? And that became a bit fuzzy when you talk about cloud computing. Whereabouts exactly is that? It's been addressed to some degree, and there are jurisdictions been set up, and so the cloud only exists in a certain place. So that's fantastic. What about the firm that you've sent it to? Then are they regulated? So are they shipping it off somewhere else, or how secure is it? And all those type of conversations, we heard them all in SFTR as well. When we're talking about regulatory reporting and the responsibility of it, I think that's actually quite clear, and it's normally, it's very clear in the regulation who is responsible for something. But still, that appetite I was talking about, some people go a bit further and they don't mind someone almost changing the data and before it's being sent off, or doing some of the reconciliation. I've certainly heard firms say, I don't care, it's just as long as it gets through to the regulator and the box is ticked and that's it, just change it to whatever. Well, obviously that's not proper, and there aren't any firms who are doing that sort of thing that I know of anyway. There was another thing when we're thinking about third parties, and this is another experience of mine. So a while ago, and I hope that firms have changed from that now, is that when we're thinking about tri-party agents, so an agent who looks after collateral, and what happens is they have a framework that measures the type of collateral coming in, the credit worthiness of it, and the applicability and that sort of thing. And that's an extension of sort of a prudential control that you would have over your fund about the type of collateral that comes in, and you're outsourcing that to another party to do that. And you need to be checking the data. Some firms don't, though. They would actually say, well, they're doing it and now it's their responsibility. But if it went wrong, then you know exactly legally, well, you can just look down the list and you can see where who's going to get the fine for it. So you have to be very clear, and again, great points being made about the SLA, not just being about the service level, but also about the liabilities that could be incurred. If there's a penalty from the regulator because something hasn't been done, actually, who's going to pay that? Whereabouts does it come through? Because the regulator is going to see who sent the data in anyway. So we haven't got to a case yet where we've had to flush that one out, but it's just a matter of time, I suppose, until something like that happens.
It's on the horizon for sure.
Yeah.
Can I just maybe just add a couple of points there? I think I think the risk around the control framework and the quality of the data that firms might have when they employ vendors to identify issues is that they're able to identify, I mean, certainly we're able to identify significantly more issues than firms traditionally have been able to do. So, I mean, we test every record, whereas previously firms and consultancies have relied on sample testing. But having identified the issues, the financial firms then need to be in a place to mobilize the respective teams within organizations to then make good on the issues that have been identified. And if we're looking at data quality issues, they, from a root cause point of view, they only fall into a handful of buckets. So either the firms interpreted the regulation incorrectly, and so therefore that needs legal and compliance to be involved to agree to any changes in interpretation. IT have coded it up incorrectly, either by direction or by accident. And again, that requires prioritization and testing. Or the firms using incorrect reference data. Now, all three of those approaches have a time lag and a prioritization case to go through. And so when firms actually identify that once they're provided with a set of issues, that's only the first part of the story to resolution, and having themselves set up that they can deal with those in an effective way is really something that firms need to focus on.
I agree, and it actually takes me to my next point, which is, and you've started us along the way. So we have the components of the control framework. We now, a firm may now have an approach. How am I going to approach it? And now it's actually implemented, and we're going through it. Are we finding that control framework is highlighting systemic or bespoke data issues? So is it as a direct result of the control framework that was kind of pushed on the firms from the regulators? Is it actually unearthing systemic issues either within the market or within their institution? And so I'm gonna, Ian, if you want to start us off again, I'll go right back to you and then over to Romaldo.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, maybe I jumped the gun there. Yeah, we definitely certainly see those systemic issues in those three areas. It will always be around interpretation, implementation of code, and then the use of reference data. And I think the two certainties that we find is that whenever you test for the quality of a firm's reporting, is you will always find issues because the obligations are complex and they're being overlaid on a complex infrastructure. But the second certainty is that once, let's say a firm gets to Nevada state of having no issues, the next certainty is that new issues will be introduced because you're not dealing with a static environment and infrastructure. You're dealing with multiple systems and platforms that are on monthly release cycles, and every release cycle or introduction of new product or new reference data is an opportunity for a new error to be introduced. It could be related just to a small subset of issues, or it could introduce a systemic issue. So we, for example, when we for one of our first clients, MiFID Go Live, a significant number of their records had issues on, close to 100%, but they were able to prioritize those systemic issues and bring that down to a real manageable number. They introduced a new upgrade to, I think it was a Fidessa platform, and that upgrade introduced 3 or 4 systemic issues that again took their error rate up close to 100%. So yes, systemic issues are being identified, but once they're fixed, new ones will be introduced if you're not testing appropriately.
And I think that eventually impacts the business, right? Because all of that data is not just, most of the time does not just affect regulatory data. So underlying, you fix those issues and you're going to actually get a benefit from on the business side. Romaldo, do you want to add to that at all?
Absolutely. I think what Ian was mentioning there are a couple of points there. So actually there are 3. One would be in regards to the complexity of the softwares, the sources that provide the data. As Ian was mentioning, there could be several types of different sprints developing different products that go live at the different given points in time. And to add to that complexity, then you may have also legacy systems that need to gather data points from different areas as well. that might not be adaptable to new conditions, to new structures, to new changes in the data processing perspective. And the third will be in terms of the upcoming regulation that comes in and forces the financial institutions to react to, okay, now we need to think about how these products are affecting the overall calculation in my case would be in capital adequacy, and how those are applied into the common reporting templates. But then, just like you mentioned, Linda, there are identifications of some types of systemic issues that once fixed, it enhances profitability of the bank's own business areas, depending where the issue is stemming from. So if the financial institution is able to identify those and adequately put those into practice to be able to fix those, then the profitability can be connected to that at the same time.
Which is a wonderful side effect, right? that we're all shooting for, whether it be cost savings from the operations side or business, on the business side. Adrian, anything around from a systemic perspective and the control framework highlighting? I would like to understand from your perspective, are there industry standards that the control framework could actually have an effect on driving when it comes to systemic data issues that we have in our financial world?
So I was going to talk about LEI. I don't know if does that match the question? Okay, so and actually, but I'll start by talking about Ian's point in terms of you're fixing one thing and then something else pops up. And I'm sure that firms have that at the moment. Some of the last reports I've looked at, again, in relation to SFTR, there's this huge long list, and it sort of moves around. And there's one thing, it doesn't disappear off the end. It sort of goes down to a lower rating. And so it's still, the issues are never completely fixed by everyone, because there isn't, in some cases, a standard for them all to work to. And I was rather optimistically hoping that as part of the SFTR rollout, that we could agree across the industries that which field should we look at first. And let's all try and let's focus on one field and try and make that one work properly. That was a bit too optimistic, and instead everyone's taking this big long list of different issues that they've got. But there is, we mentioned collaboration earlier on when we were having a chat, and I think that collaboration is helping to fix some of those issues, but they're always going to be around until there's a standard central point. And a great example of all of this is the LEI. So this legal entity identifier, absolutely unanimously agreed by all firms that it's a great thing to have, and it's a great way of measuring risk, exactly who your counterparty is. Now you've got a reference point to be unique with the legal counterpart you're trading with, or who issued the security, which is the issue that we have at the moment. So you've got this field in SFTR, which is a European-based regulation, and it requires this LEI to be filled in for the issuer of a security, mandatory field in Europe. So why would someone in North or South America care about registering this thing? Or over in APAC region, for instance, as well. So we've been running surveys now for about a year, I suppose, and we've got one running at the moment with in between 5 and 10 other trade associations are also reaching out to the members to give us all the securities that you can see that you think are going to be reported at some point under SFTR, and they'll see whether if they're not registered with their LEI, then let's give it to Gleif and Anna, who Gleif obviously look after the LEI, and Anna the numbering association. Let's identify exactly where they are not being registered and see if we can get them registered. And interestingly, so you get about 50,000 securities at the moment. Well, that was in the last survey. I don't know how many are going to come out of this one. And there were a lot in Japan, for instance, and the Japanese exchange didn't like the look of it because LEI is something that was agreed, by G20. It's quite a globally agreed standard, and they quickly changed that. But we still see North and South America that there are issues dropping out, and we've got this deadline looming now of actually non-European or non-EEA LEIs weren't being validated, and now they're going to be later on, perhaps next year. At the point that happens, it's going to start throwing data out. And I made the point to the regulators at the time that if you make something like that mandatory, where the industry doesn't have the ability to go and register it themselves, the only losers from all this will be the regulators, because then the data won't appear because you put a validation on it. So it's it's one of those standards that it's like I said, it's a great example. You need a global standard, everyone to use it, and it just to be a mandatory field. And the firms who are doing this is the best bit about it. The firms who are doing the reporting, they are normally typically they're the firms who helped to issue the security in the first place, and they should have been also helping get this LEI registered. So in this next survey, they may get told that a little bit more publicly than before.
That's great. Thank you, Adrian. So we know data validation. We've just spoken a lot about data validation. I guess my next question is about how deep do we go? So a lot of the first level of validation is on the fields that are actually reported in the report. And that's common sense. Of course, we want to get those right. But a lot of those attributes are derived from a number of attributes underneath. So we spoke a little bit about SFTR. Security type, it takes understanding if an equity instrument is part of an index, and if the issuer is in a financial institution. So there's a whole bunch of underlying data that needs to be accurate in order for you to derive the SFTR security type. And so I'm wondering, when you look at the control framework, do you think that there's enough emphasis happening to look under the covers at all the different layers of data that are needed to get what you actually report correct? And Ian, if you want to kick us off with that one.
Yeah, I think it depends very much on the field that you're reporting. So with data quality, you're looking for feedback loops which allow you to understand whether that data is correct or not. And any field that is included in the trade life cycle, from execution through to confirmation, settlement and financing, you have a natural feedback loop. And so typically the core economics are in a pretty good state. But the regulators, since the Pittsburgh G20 summit, have introduced a plethora of fields that are used only for reporting, and so you don't have a feedback loop in the trade life cycle for those fields. And obviously for those fields, it is not sufficient just to rely on some basic validation, because, as we said before, it might be valid but wrong. So we very much, the approach that we take is we test every field. And so we have, for SFTR testing, we have over 800 tests now, which we run on each individual field. And it's really important to use independent reference data, not just instrument and counterparty, but other sources of data, to try and create that feedback loop where it's not there. And in so doing, you then really do drive out a number of the data inaccuracies that would otherwise go unnoticed.
Thanks. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, if I can. I was more sort of put it back to Ian a little bit, but there was so much data being asked, and you did see sort of a period of firms sort of going, okay, let's take MiFID 65 fields, but which ones are important? And it kind of it went round in circles for a period, but I do think eventually you had one of the regulators come out and say, look, they're all equal, get them right. And it was, rather than, okay, pick the 10 that you're getting. Is that fair? I think it maybe a couple of years ago now.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, all fields are equal, but maybe in the same way that the Prime Minister is first among equals in the cabinet, there are some that fit into that category. I think also when we look at it from an EU setting, there were fields that some competent authorities were more interested in than others. So you got different pressures from that point of view. But you're right. The most effective way is that they are the fields. Don't try and cherry pick, and you need to get as comprehensive level of testing against each of those fields as possible. Because if we go back to the return on investment, it's hard to articulate to senior management the return on investment when you're designing your control framework and testing. When you don't have any issues or you don't have any regulatory censure, it's very easy to make that return on investment after the event. And so therefore, I agree, Chris, you've got to try and get all the fields right, even though some you might question the validity of why they've been asked.
Yeah, and I think as well, recent session, if you think about it as well, about the optics of what you are reporting. So analyzing things that you're doing on quite a broad basis. You were talking about people's approach to certain fields like defaulting or some of the easier options. But if you take a step back, that's a very easy to identify from a data perspective. And if it's easy for you to identify, it's probably easy for the regulator. And that then is drawing naturally attention to, well, if you're doing that, what else are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. I think firms need to remember as well, actually, it's that the interaction between firms and regulators is quite limited for them to actually get a day-to-day view of how the business is being run. But one of the windows they do have are the reports that we make, either from a trade and transaction point of view, or from the prudential side of things that we were hearing about earlier. And so getting this data incorrect, it does lead regulators to ask those broader questions around your control framework and your general procedures in running the bank. And depending on where you are in other conversations with the regulators, this can be a tipping point. So quite often we see regulators looking at reporting and identifying issues there. But it's like, I think the point that you're making there, Chris, is in a woolly jumper. If you pull a thread, it tends to unravel. So we certainly see that as a significant issue.
Maybe I can just chip in a little bit there, if that's okay, Linda.
Absolutely.
This is an interesting conversation, if anything, as well. I think to the point that you were just making there, Ian, increasing the collaboration with the regulator is absolutely key as well in so many of the cases, right? Because then having this proactive discussion with them can help you identify some of these gaps ahead of time, but also maybe from the making sure that you are, as a financial institution, identifying the gaps from the common reporting perspective, from the capital side that I'm coming from. It will be unifying the different frameworks that are required, because there are so many different data points that are there, and some of these data points have cross checks in a way.
Yes.
So if you start from those cross checks, unifying those data points through your reporting stream, then that will be the key areas to add the investments to secure that those are at least aligned, and then within those identify the gaps that could be that are spillovers from those cross points, because it's a broad term with having so many data points to check, but having the cross checks actually helps you identify those ahead of time.
I think you're right, and picking up on Chris's point previously, that regulators are, they're able to take advantage of RegTech developments as well. And they are able to identify these issues. We take MiFID, for example. They're able to map trades now that have the same trading venue ID. They won't know which side is wrong, but they'll know that there's a difference, and that can be automated from a regulator's point of view. And I think we will see that in the coming months and years. I think we also need to recognise that after the last financial crash, the regulators said, well, we couldn't see it coming because we didn't have the data. We've now gone through over a decade of regulatory requirements, and the regulators got pretty much everything they asked for. And therefore, the quality of the data is really important, because if the next crisis comes and it's, well, we had the data, but it wasn't in good enough quality, well, then it will be, well, what were you doing about getting that quality up to scratch so you can actually do the work that's expected of you? So, and I think just finally on this point, again, it's counterintuitive, but firms not going to the regulator and saying, I've got issues with my data, is suspicious in itself. So the firms that will be in the regulators' sights most are the firms that they hear nothing from, because we all know that there's issues in quality of data, because there always will be.
That's a great point. I heard the word automation a couple times during the last round of answers. So I'm going to jump to that a bit. And I know we're not all CTOs, but in the grand scheme of things, are we seeing that new technologies, that investments are being made in new technologies or new solutions in order to help with the control framework? Are secondary sources of data? Is there spend in the automation aspect, I guess, of data that is helping with the control framework evolution, I guess? And Adrian, if you have any comments on this around how you're seeing the old platforms versus new platforms, et cetera, and so forth.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll pick up on that to begin with, because there are, when you say old platforms, there are old platforms that they're nearly as old as us. but they're certainly around from the last century and written in languages that it's difficult to find the staff for now, and they're certainly creaking in trying to deal with these new requirements. So, but to just get back to the question more sort of more centrally, is that, so we're a trade association, and obviously we're not doing our own investment in a system. But what we did see, and we published a paper called Agenda for Change, was that the market's sort of is getting to this point now, and there's lots of this exception management going on, and the new requirements coming on top of it, and it needs to go through some sort of change to get to bring it to this century, I suppose. So the document was called Agenda for Change. It's on our website. It identified the life cycle of our market, from getting to know each other, so the KYC, legal documentation, doing a trade, maintenance of it, the collateral, and then I call it a Dear John, but it's basically the default situation that happens at the end. And that's the life cycle of many financial markets work like that. And if you look at all of those components, you can say, well, actually, you can automate all these things. There's technology that's been around, actually some of the best technology, like the blockchain and distributed ledger, I think when that was published, in 2008 or 2009, exactly when the crash was happening, and it's taken us this long, we still haven't adopted it fully. So, like I said before, we're not going to build a tool that, or rather an application for the market to use, but what we can do is we can make tools available to them. And there's 3 associations. So ISDA is one of them, ISDA for the derivatives and ICMA for the repo market. We published a letter and sent it out to all the regulators to say, we're committed to changing the market and giving it a tool that will allow it to adopt new technologies and make itself fit for purpose in the future. And we're all working on a thing called the common domain model, which a simple way of putting it, I mean, it's a little bit like an XML type of structured data. But the most important thing from my perspective is that we encode best practice into it. So it's fit for purpose, and it fits an industry standard as well. And there's lots of things that come out of having that. So we make it freely available for obviously our members, but more wider for everyone to use, because it's got derivatives and repo and collateral in it. And it's a structure that could be used. You could build an application with that being your sort of data architecture. You're all going to be talking the same language, which means all these things, all these legacy issues that you had actually since the market started. So the reconciliation breaks and not talking the same language in terms of, well, I think the trade, when it went through this maintenance cycle, this thing happened, and somebody expresses it in a different way. All that disappears, both for in the internal communication in one firm and external. So you solve interoperability in that as well. And I'll just finish up by saying, so that we started working on that, but actually regulators are looking at it as well. And there've been pilot studies that were done a couple of years ago, and they come out with some very interesting numbers that in a single jurisdiction, the cost of regulatory reporting is somewhere between 3 and 5 billion for the regulator. And I don't mention the currency because it's the same, it doesn't matter whether it's sterling or pounds, it's that much for them. And they're looking, okay, what can we do to get better data and not have this enormous cost associated with the developer on our side, and not an associated cost for the market to do it as well. And so this pilot that was done, it was done in the UK, but there are other regulators looking at it around the world. They pull the data out rather than it being pushed to them, which is a completely, flipped around to the dynamic we have at the moment. So you've got this regulatory sort of imperative it's trundling along, and you can find it, if you just Google the work that they're doing, it's all freely available as well. So I think that's the direction we're going to go in. And then the data points that they ask for, well, they'll be part of a market standard. Everyone would be expected to have that data there, and it'd be standard and fit for purpose. And so that completely changes the dynamic of the conversation we've been having today when we get to that point. And just a final point, there are discussions coming out of panels in Europe where they see the horizon for that adoption getting to a point where regulators will be using it somewhere between 3 and 5 years. So there's an adoption pathway right now that's happening, with regulators working on it and vendors looking at it in our working groups and in the other associations as well. So very, very exciting time.
That's all very good information. Thank you so much, Adrian. And I from my background, I can't emphasize how much I don't think people appreciate standards and being able to say talking apples to apples affects the cost of maintenance or implementation of all of the technology that has to go into our regulatory reporting. So Chris, I'm going to just touch really quick with you on what about moving to the cloud and anything else you want to add regarding technology and new approaches to this wonderful world.
No worries, and I appreciate you making the CTO point, because I'm conscious my tech peers are probably sitting nervously going, who let Chris talk about technology? But on the last point around standardization, there's obviously quite a lot of work on harmonization. One of the key points that is going to be critical to the success of global harmonization is understanding that similar is not the same, right? So, and what I mean by that is, if all the regulators put something that is similar in from a cost perspective, you're actually still paying to do it 5-6 times. Whereas if it's the same, like the LEI, for example, then it's a one implementation. It's a lot simpler. So that is exciting, and it's an opportunity, and I hope one that's taken. From a technology point of view, I agree with Adrian, super exciting. Seeing some really cool reg tech come through. The one thing that I'm sort of looking at, and I think I could talk about 5 or 6 here, but is detecting change. And what I mean by that is, Ian was talking around. There'll always be a list of issues, because as you fix something or fix 2 or 3 things, something else changes somewhere else. But actually, this technology is now sort of there or being worked on. You can see that. You can see that almost straight away. Identify it and take action. It's talking about having a quick feedback loop. When we spoke about that at data, but also from a technology perspective. So as we see some of this become more mainstream, I think that will be quite exciting. Cloud obviously is one of the facilitators of that in terms of being able to analyze large data quickly and in more real time as well.
Thank you, Romaldo. I don't know if you or anybody else want to add to the technology or automation, I guess.
I could chip in if that's okay, Linda. So basically to the same topic that Chris was touching upon there a little bit on, it's when choosing maybe the type of solution that might fit your financial institution, you need to pay attention to different aspects, right? Is it scalable to the current setup that you have? Are your legacy systems able to fit into this new solution? Is it going to cost more by implementing it or not? And I would say that the general notion is that the budgets are getting a little bit not squeezed, but at least compensated in a way that we need to be able to put forward a good balance in terms of implementing something that will enable us to be automated and more cross-connected with all the data that we have. And as I was mentioning before, how is this connected to the profitability of the business as well? Are we going to get some real gains out of making sure that the data quality is stronger than it was before? And just to finalize that point would be that just the importance of getting an automated solution and how that can be, if there are issues within it, in the reconciliation topic that we had before, for example, if you're reconciling one of the frameworks, can that be automatically reconciled everywhere, right? Can you transcribe one correction or one activity that needs to be fixed in one area across all the different frameworks that need to be reported for the financial institution? So I think that's obviously key to be able to capture in any of the, as mentioned, various types of solutions that might be out there in the market.
And just literally 10 seconds to back up both those points. I think one of the most exciting developments from an IT point of view is the idea of DevOps, and the fact that IT teams are now moving to that when they build their code, at the same time they build their testing for that part of the code. And in doing that, that allows you to test at scale. And to Chris's point, prevent those issues from getting into production before that code goes live. That's that links that methodology with automation, which I think is a really powerful and exponential effect on the quality of code that's going into production.
I know. Yeah, go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, just add, because I remember a couple of years ago when in SFTR discussions, the term golden record was coming up quite often. And actually, there is a technology out there right now that does that. So, like a blockchain distributed ledger, it solves for the reconciliation issue across different platforms. And also, so there's one ledger that's distributed exactly as it says. And so all the systems would have the same record at the same time. And there's your golden record. If we'd had that in place 10 years ago, then SFTR we wouldn't have even known about it. The regulator would have just taken what we've got.
The only problem being is that even within individual organisations, people will have 10 definitions about what one product is. And that's why we have the CDM. Yeah. So there's a standard representation for it. Yeah. They will still have 10 definitions.
Oh, absolutely. Agreed. Yeah. Yep.
And I think just to close off the technology aspect, I think as we talk to different firms, I know we see there's such a disparity between the tech level of comfort with certain technologies firm to firm. And so you have, different number of legacy systems, I was at a firm recently and we talked about APIs and they said, oh, no, I don't want to talk about APIs yet. And I thought, oh my gosh, the next day I go to a firm and all they want to do is talk about APIs. And so I think, when you talk about, all of the fun technology that we have, everybody's at different levels of comfort when it comes to cloud, when it comes to ledger, when it comes to different ways to automate your controls and your data management. So yeah, I know we need to wrap up. One point that I'm realizing that I would love to speak about, and maybe that it's our next roundtable, which is, you touched on it a bit, Ian, just then, it's about the embedded expertise within the firms and the human aspect of getting this right. I love technology, but there's also an element that you have to have that expertise inside, because you're going to get a break, even if you have the best automation in the world. And so who are those experts that understand the data enough to address those breaks and then put forward changes that could possibly help your organization? So we are almost out of time. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to one final question, and going a little off script, but if you were a consultant walking into a firm that had and the firm said, what's the first thing I should do? I'm trying to get my control framework in check. What is the first place I should start? Where would you tell them to start? Whoever wants to go first.
I can jump into that, Mo, maybe.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. So the first thing that I would just try to put forward is making sure that we have a clear strategic direction. Because without it, then trying to implement a control framework across the board will mostly have very difficulties. So having a clear management understanding of what the direction should be, and that's key.
Let's start at the top with the strategic outlook, and then everything else can fall forward. Anybody else?
I've got an answer, because obviously it's not my speciality, so I'd say call you. I suppose the answer.
Thank you. Ian? Maybe we would have to call you.
Yeah, I guess we would advise baseline. Get a view on how bad or how good or how bad your data is, and we do that pretty quickly in a free POC if anyone's interested. So yeah, give us a call.
Wonderful. Chris, how about you? Final word.
I think the regulation, particularly in the UK, has sort of done this, but I would make sure you're looking at it from the right seniority, because it starts with the governance, and understand the right sort of vision, which has been touched on, and appetite overall. And I would start there and then work through maybe calling each of you. But yeah,
wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you guys so much. It was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed the time with all of you, and I appreciate you spending some time with us. And so I also want to thank all of our listeners today. I hope you found the conversation useful and informative. So I'm going to hand it back over to Alexia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda, for moderating this very interactive discussion, and special thanks to our incredible panel for sharing their expertise with us today. That is all the time we had just now. We did receive a number of questions, and we'll make sure to follow up with each one of you after the event. And with that, I would also like to remind you all that we'll be circulating a copy of today's session in the next couple of hours. And finally, on behalf of SmartStream and Connect Global Group, thank you all for tuning in and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you and have a good day further.